The autumn mud of France clung to everything in 1944, boots, rifles, and the bitter pride of defeated men. Behind the coils of barbed wire at Camp Lucky Strike, rows of German prisoners of war watched as American GIs marched past their compound. The rhythmic thud of boots on wet earth should have been familiar to these veterans of the Wehrmacht, but something about it irritated them. Oberst Heinrich Müller adjusted his torn field tunic and nudged the man beside him. "Look at them," he whispered in German, his voice dripping with disdain. "Children playing at war." His fellow officers chuckled quietly, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. These were men who had once commanded panzer divisions across the steppes of Russia, who had orchestrated lightning strikes through the Ardennes. Now they stood behind American wire, watching their captors with the contempt of professionals observing amateurs. The American soldiers seemed almost casual in their bearing. They talked among themselves as they marched, some chewing gum, others smoking cigarettes that they somehow kept lit despite the drizzle. To German eyes, trained under the iron discipline of Prussian military tradition, this looked like nothing more than a mob in uniform. "They march like farmers going to market," sneered Hauptmann Klaus Weber, a veteran of Rommel's Africa Corps. His scarred face bore witness to 3 years of desert warfare, and his eyes held the hard certainty of a man who had never questioned the superiority of German military science. The other prisoners nodded in agreement, their laughter low but audible enough that some of the passing Americans glanced toward the fence. One young GI, perhaps 19 years old, with mud splattered across his helmet, caught sight of the German officers. Instead of the rigid acknowledgement they expected, he simply nodded, a casual gesture that some who felt more insulting than outright hostility. This was not the behavior of proper soldiers. Where was the fear? Where was the respect for their military heritage? "Soft," Müller concluded, using the English word he had learned from interrogations. "Soft and undisciplined. It is a miracle they have made it this far." The irony of his words would not become apparent for months, but in that moment, standing in the cold French rain, the German officers felt certain of one thing. Whatever strange circumstances had led to their capture, it was not because the Americans had proven themselves superior soldiers. The laughter that echoed behind the wire that day would be remembered by many, not for its humor, but for how completely wrong it would prove to be. To understand the depth of German arrogance, one must first understand the machine that had created it. For over 2 centuries, Prussian military doctrine had shaped the German officer corps into something unique in the world, a brotherhood of steel and precision that viewed war as the highest form of art. The German war machine of 1939 was not born overnight. It emerged from the military academies of Potsdam, where young cadets learned that discipline meant absolute obedience, that initiative was dangerous, and that the chain of command was sacred. Every morning began at 500 hours with inspections so rigid that a single loose button could result in punishment. Officers were taught to see their men not as individuals, but as components in a greater mechanism. This system had produced stunning victories. In just 6 weeks, German forces had brought France to its knees. Poland had fallen in 27 days. The speed and coordination of these campaigns seemed to prove that German military science was indeed superior to anything the democratic nations could produce. Officers like Müller and Weber had witnessed firsthand how their precise, hierarchical system could overwhelm enemies who lacked their discipline. But this same system had bred a dangerous blindness. German intelligence reports consistently underestimated American military capability, dismissing their forces as a nation of shopkeepers playing soldier. The prevailing wisdom among German staff officers was that Americans were too individualistic, too democratic, to ever achieve true military excellence. How could soldiers who questioned orders, who elected their own sergeants in some units, who seemed to treat war like an inconvenient interruption of civilian life, possibly compete with the heirs of Frederick the Great? The evidence seemed to support their contempt. American soldiers in the early days, of North Africa had indeed appeared green and uncoordinated. They laughed too much, complained too openly, and seemed to lack the robotic precision that German officers equated with military virtue. When Rommel's Africa Corps first clashed with American forces at Kasserine Pass in 1943, the results had seemed to confirm every stereotype. American units had broken and fled in confusion. What the German officers failed to recognize was that they were witnessing not weakness but adaptation. The American military was learning, evolving, and developing its own form of discipline, one that would prove far more flexible and ultimately more effective than the rigid Prussian model they revered. But in those prisoner-of-war camps of 1944, with defeat still fresh and bitter, the German officers clung to their old certainties. They had been the masters of Europe. They had conquered nations with clockwork precision. The casual competence of their American captors had to be a facade, a lucky accident that would crumble under real pressure. The American approach to military discipline was something entirely foreign to German understanding. Where German soldiers stood in perfect formation, Americans seemed almost anarchic. They called their officers by first names. They improvised solutions instead of following precise doctrine. They treated warfare not as a sacred ritual, but as a problem to be solved through ingenuity and cooperation. Staff Sergeant Tommy O'Brien from Boston embodied this difference perfectly. At 24, he commanded a squad of men from 8 different states, each with their own accent, their own way of seeing the world. When German prisoners watched him work, they saw chaos. Men joking while they cleaned their weapons, soldiers arguing about the best way to dig a foxhole, a non-commissioned officer who asked for opinions instead of simply giving orders. What they couldn't see was the invisible thread that bound these men together. It wasn't fear of punishment or blind obedience to authority. It was something more subtle and ultimately more powerful, mutual respect earned through shared hardship. O'Brien's men followed him not because regulations demanded it, but because they trusted his judgment and knew he would never waste their lives carelessly. This fundamental difference in military culture had roots that ran deep into American society. The citizen soldiers of the U.S. Army brought with them the democratic values of a nation built on individual initiative. They were men who had grown up questioning authority, solving problems independently, and working together as equals. The military structure they created reflected these values, even when it appeared undisciplined to outside observers. German officers, watching American soldiers maintain their equipment or prepare for operations, saw only sloppiness where they should have seen efficiency. When Americans modified standards, procedures to fit local conditions, Germans saw insubordination where they should have recognized adaptation. When American units operated with a minimum of formal ceremony, Germans saw unprofessionalism where they should have seen confidence. The tragic irony was that this chaos was actually a more sophisticated form of order, one that could function without constant supervision, that could adapt to changing circumstances, and that drew strength from the initiative of individual soldiers rather than the rigid hierarchy of command. It was discipline of the mind and spirit rather than merely of the body. But as the German prisoners watched their captors through the wire in late 1944, they remained convinced that what they witnessed was weakness masquerading as strength, amateur enthusiasm that would crumble when tested against professional military skill. The transport trucks carrying German prisoners eastward through France revealed a landscape that told the story of 2 different kinds of military organization. As the convoy rolled through devastated villages and past burned-out German equipment, the captured officers began to see evidence of something they hadn't expected: American military engineering on a scale that defied their understanding of democratic inefficiency. Every bridge that had been destroyed by retreating German forces had been rebuilt, not just repaired, but often improved, with American engineers working under shellfire to restore the flow of men and supplies. The German prisoners, many of whom had participated in the scorched earth retreats that left these bridges in ruins, watched in silence as convoy after convoy of American vehicles crossed structures that should not have existed. Oberst Müller pressed his face to the canvas of the transport truck and stared at a Bailey bridge spanning the Seine. His own engineers had blown the original stone bridge with mathematical precision, creating a gap that should have halted American advances for weeks. Yet here was this temporary structure, assembled with American speed and efficiency, carrying the weight of Sherman tanks as if it were permanent construction. "How long?" he asked the American guard. The young corporal thought for a moment. 3 days, he replied. "Maybe 4. They work pretty fast." The German officers exchanged glances. Their own engineering manuals called for minimum construction times twice that long, and that was under ideal conditions with experienced crews. These Americans were accomplishing the impossible with what appeared to be casual competence. At a fuel depot outside Reims, the convoy stopped for maintenance. Through gaps in the canvas, the prisoners watched as American quartermasters coordinated the refueling of dreads of vehicles with assembly line precision. There were no shouted orders, no dramatic displays of authority. Instead, they witnessed something that looked almost civilian in its organization, men working together with quiet efficiency, each knowing his role without constant supervision. Private First Class Mike Kowalski, a former auto mechanic from Detroit, directed traffic with hand signals and occasional calls to drivers by name. To German eyes, this looked unprofessional, even chaotic. Where were the rigid protocols? Where was the visible hierarchy that should govern such operations? Yet somehow vehicles moved through the depot faster than German logistics officers had thought possible. The most disturbing sight came at a field hospital near Metz. German prisoners were brought close enough to witness American medics treating wounded soldiers, both American and German, with identical care and efficiency. Oberst Müller had seen German field hospitals, models of medical precision where every procedure followed established protocol. This American facility looked improvised, almost makeshift, yet the survival rates were clearly superior to anything he had witnessed in Wehrmacht medical units. As the convoy continued eastward, the German officers fell into an uncomfortable silence. The evidence accumulating around them suggested something they were reluctant to acknowledge, that their captors possessed a form of military organization that was not only effective, but perhaps superior to their own cherished system. The laughter from behind the wire was beginning to sound hollow, even to themselves. December 16, 1944, brought news that should have vindicated every German prisoner's faith in superior military doctrine. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last desperate gamble, had smashed through American lines with all the precision and violence that had made German arms famous across Europe. In POW camps throughout France, captured Wehrmacht officers listened to reports of American units fleeing in panic, of entire divisions dissolving under the hammer blow of German panzer spearheads. Oberst Müller allowed himself a thin smile as he heard the distant rumble of artillery from the northeast. Perhaps his captors would finally learn what real soldiers could accomplish when properly led and disciplined. The soft Americans, with their casual discipline and democratic methods, were about to discover the difference between playing at war and waging it professionally. But as the days passed, something unexpected began to emerge from the chaos of the Bulge. Radio intercepts and prisoner reports painted a picture that didn't fit German expectations. Yes, American units had been surprised and overrun in the initial assault. Yes, there had been confusion and retreat, but there had also been something else, something that German military doctrine had no framework to explain. At Bastogne, surrounded American paratroopers had been offered surrender terms by German forces. The response, delivered by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, consisted of a single word: nuts. This wasn't the calculated defiance of professional soldiers following orders. It was something more visceral, more personal. These Americans were choosing to fight not because regulations demanded it, but because something deeper compelled them to resist. The reports filtering back to the POW camps grew more disturbing as German prisoners were brought in from the failed offensive. They spoke of American soldiers, who had held impossible positions without orders to do so, of units that had reformed spontaneously after being scattered, of logistics personnel who had picked up rifles and fought as infantry when the situation demanded it. Hauptmann Weber listened to accounts from a young grenadier captured near Malmedy. "They should have broken," the soldier insisted, his face still bearing the shock of recent combat. "We hit them with everything, panzers, artillery, the entire weight of 3 divisions, but they just wouldn't quit. Even when their officers were killed, even when they were cut off and surrounded, they kept fighting." This was not the behavior anticipated from undisciplined troops. German tactical doctrine was built on the assumption that enemy units would collapse when their command structure was disrupted, that democratic soldiers would lose cohesion without constant leadership. But the Americans seemed to draw strength from within their ranks, to generate leadership organically when formal authority was eliminated. Most troubling of all were reports of German units being counterattacked by hastily assembled American formations that included cooks, clerks, and mechanics fighting alongside infantry. This violated every principle of military specialization that German officers held sacred, yet somehow it was working. As news of the offensive's ultimate failure reached the camps, the German officers found themselves grappling with evidence that challenged their most fundamental assumptions about warfare, discipline, and the nature of military excellence. The morning drill at Camp Lucky Strike had become a daily ritual that drew German prisoners to the fence like spectators at a performance they couldn't understand. Every day at 0600 hours, American soldiers formed up in the compound adjacent to the POW enclosure for physical training and close-order drill. To German eyes, accustomed to the mechanical precision of Prussian drill, what they witnessed should have been confirmation of American military inferiority. The Americans didn't move with the robotic synchronization that German officers had learned to expect from properly trained soldiers. Their formations weren't perfectly aligned, their cadence wasn't mathematically precise, yet something about their bearing had changed since those first days of mocking laughter behind the wire. Oberst Müller found himself drawn to the fence each morning, no longer to ridicule, but to observe something he was struggling to comprehend. The American soldiers moved with a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with fear of punishment. When their sergeant called commands, they responded not with the mechanical obedience of automatons, but with the focused attention of professionals who understood their craft. The change was most visible in the eyes. German prisoners had been trained to recognize the look of properly disciplined soldiers, the slightly vacant stare of men who had learned to suppress individual thought in favor of collective action. But these Americans looked back at them with alert intelligence, as if each soldier was thinking, evaluating, ready to adapt to changing circumstances without waiting for orders from above. During one particularly precise drill movement, Hauptmann Weber turned to Müller with a troubled expression. "They're not afraid," he said quietly in German. "They should be afraid. Of their officers, of punishment, of making mistakes. But they're not." And this observation struck at the heart of German military philosophy, which held that discipline was impossible without fear as its foundation. The American sergeant leading the drill was a man named Jackson, a former schoolteacher from Alabama who had earned his stripes in the bocage country of Normandy. His voice carried authority, but it was the authority of competence rather than rank. When he corrected a soldier's posture, it was with the patience of an instructor rather than the harshness of a disciplinarian. When the formation made an error, he stopped and explained the proper technique, instead of simply demanding repetition. As the drill concluded and the American soldiers dispersed to their daily duties, the German officers remained at the fence in uncomfortable silence. The laughter that had once echoed behind the wire had vanished completely, replaced by a growing recognition that they were witnessing something their military education had never prepared them to understand. The discipline they observed was not imposed from above, but generated from within, a collective commitment to excellence that drew its strength from mutual respect rather than mutual fear. The letters began arriving in February 1945, carried by American male clerks who seemed genuinely surprised that German prisoners were allowed to correspond with their families. In the Wehrmacht, mail had been a privilege to be earned, censored heavily, and sometimes withheld as punishment. Here it was treated as a basic right, managed with the same casual efficiency that characterized everything American. Oberst Müller struggled with how to describe his captivity to his wife in Bavaria. The words he had been taught to use, discipline, order, military bearing, seemed inadequate to explain what he witnessed daily. How could he tell her that their captors maintained military effectiveness without the iron framework of fear and punishment that had shaped his entire career? "The Americans have a different understanding of discipline," he finally wrote, knowing the censors would read every word. "It is not the discipline of the parade ground, but something that comes from within each soldier. They follow orders not because they must, but because they choose to trust their leaders." This concept of voluntary discipline was revolutionary to men raised in the Prussian tradition. German military theory held that soldiers were essentially civilians who had to be forced into military behavior through constant pressure and the threat of severe punishment. The idea that men might choose to be soldiers, might embrace military values without coercion, challenged everything they had been taught about human nature and military organization. Captain James Mitchell, the American officer responsible for the POW camp, embodied this paradox. He commanded respect without demanding it, maintained order without the visible apparatus of punishment that German officers considered essential. When problems arose among the prisoners, he solved them through discussion and negotiation rather than an arbitrary authority. The most telling moment came when a group of younger German prisoners attempted to organize according to old Wehrmacht hierarchy, with former officers assuming automatic command over enlisted men. Mitchell intervened not with punishment, but with patient explanation that in American custody, military rank held no special privileges. What mattered was behavior, cooperation, and contribution to the common good. This was democracy extended into military life, a concept that seemed impossibly naive to German officers, yet somehow produced results superior to their cherished system of rigid hierarchy. The evidence was all around them, in the efficiency of their captors, in the high morale of American units, in the ultimate success of American arms against the professional German military machine. The discipline of freedom they were learning might be more powerful than the discipline of fear. Liberation came to the POW camps in May 1945, but the lessons learned behind American wire would echo through the lives of German officers for decades to come. As transport trucks arrived to carry them to processing centers for eventual repatriation, many prisoners found themselves reluctant to leave, not because they had grown comfortable with captivity, but because they were still trying to understand what they had witnessed. Oberst Müller's final conversation with Captain Mitchell took place in the camp commander's office, over coffee that had been shared freely despite regulations that technically prohibited such fraternization. "I still don't understand," Müller admitted in careful English. "How do you maintain discipline without fear? How do you create soldiers without breaking them first?" Mitchell thought for a long moment before answering. "We don't make soldiers," he said finally. "We help citizens become soldiers while remaining citizens. The discipline comes from understanding why they fight, not just how to fight." This distinction would haunt Müller for the rest of his life. In post-war Germany, as he struggled to build a new existence in a defeated nation, he found himself returning again and again to that conversation. The American approach to military leadership, based on earned respect rather than inherited authority, began to seem less naive and more profound. Letters exchanged between former POWs in the years after the war revealed a gradual shift in their understanding of what they had experienced. Hauptmann Weber, working as a civil engineer in the reconstruction of Hamburg, wrote to Müller about watching American construction crews rebuilding German infrastructure. "They work the same way they fought," he observed, "with that same combination of individual initiative and collective purpose that we mistook for chaos." The irony was not lost on these veterans of Hitler's war machine. They had been the products of a military system that prized precision above adaptability, obedience above intelligence, conformity above creativity. They had laughed at American soldiers who seemed to embody everything their training had taught them to despise. Yet those same Americans had proven more effective in battle, more resilient under pressure, and ultimately more successful in achieving their military objectives. By the 1960s, as both former enemies settled into the routines of peace, many German veterans had come to a conclusion that would have seemed impossible in 1944. The Americans had possessed a superior form of military discipline all along. It was discipline rooted not in fear, but in freedom, not in blind obedience, but in intelligent cooperation, not in the suppression of individual will, but in its focused application toward common goals. The laughter behind the wire had ended not with defeat, but with education, a hard-earned understanding that true strength comes not from breaking the human spirit, but from unleashing its potential.